I am here this week with my dear friend Chrissy Benson, Renaissance woman extraordinaire, podcast hostess, author, lawyer. I mean, what can't you do, Chrissy? And in
I'm finding
addition,
out every day.
and I'm also here with Peaches. Peaches has just joined the party. And in addition to all of those things, I wanted to talk today because you also are certified in and have this background in internal family systems, which is this therapeutic modality that I've always found very intriguing, but I don't know a lot about myself. And so I'm sort of just interested in having a conversation about what it is, how you use it, how it's helped you, and also where it intersects maybe with evolutionary psychology and how it can be integrated into a broader model of just getting to know ourselves better and improving our circumstances in life, which is, of course, the main thing that we want to do. So, is there anything else you want to say about yourself by way of introduction, or should we just jump right in?
Yeah, we can jump right in. And just one point of clarification. I'm not actually certified in
Oh,
IFS through their
okay.
institute. So I've done multiple trainings and I've led peer practice groups, but they have a formal certification process
Okay.
with a bunch of hoops. So I have not gone through
Okay.
that, but I am a trained practitioner listed on the IFS site as a practitioner.
That is
So
a very subtle distinction. That's
yes,
okay.
yes.
Well, good clarification. So yeah, how did you, so in IFS stands for internal family systems. And what is that and how did you come across it? I guess is the top level question.
Yeah, well, for one, the name internal family systems is pretty confusing. And it was the model was developed by a psychologist named Richard Schwartz, Dick Schwartz in Boston. And he even has said a couple of times that he wishes he'd come up with a different name for it because the name is kind of confusing. It's not really about families. It's
Mm.
individual counseling, but it just recognizes the idea that we have as individuals, we have different parts to our personalities. And IFS just takes the view that each of these parts is almost like a human being, is almost like its own individual with its own fears and motivations and skills and, preferences. And so IFS is a method for facilitating a discussion between the person being counseled, the client, and the client's various parts. And what comes out of that process is really interesting. So IFS is a different sort of modality from traditional talk therapy. And that's one of the things that I love about it is in traditional therapy, it's a client going in, kind of jumping out all their problems, just laying it all out there. And then the therapist is this expert on a pedestal, receives all this information and issues a diagnosis and, proceeds to lay out, okay, how this can be navigated or cured or treated.
Mhm.
With IFS, it's very different because with IFS, the therapist is not any sort of expert or superior or authority. What the counselor does is facilitate a dialogue between the client and the part. So the therapist will suggest questions for the client to ask her part. So in other words, the client will get quiet. It takes some getting used to. I'll mention that, and some people take to it more naturally than others, but I found like lots of different people can benefit from it once you get used to it. But it's also very consistent with like mindfulness and meditation because a lot of the IFS process is the client getting quiet, and the lingo in IFS is to go inside, so we sit
Mm.
there and we go inside, and often the eyes are closed, and
Mm.
or the person may even be lying down with the camera off sometimes. And then the therapist will suggest a question for the client to ask apart, and the client will get quiet and convey that question to the part and receive some sort of information. Sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's more like a voice or a message. But it's a fascinating process, and what I love about it is that it's so non-hierarchical. All of the answers are coming from the client. The
Mhm.
therapist is just facilitating this conversation. And in literally every single IFS session I've ever done, which is many, many at this point, it's always surprising what comes out of the session, even
Mhm.
to the client and the therapist alike. So
Mm.
that's just a little intro, but there's so much I could talk about with IFS. So happy to explain anything
Yeah.
you're curious about.
No, it's so interesting. It's very you and I have been talking about I've been reading this wonderful Quaker author Parker Palmer, who talks about the Quaker tradition of circles of trust and also clearing committees, which are about helping people move through big decisions or big transitions in life. But it's just holding that person in space and asking them questions to let that, I think they usually call it the inner voice or the inner teacher, kind of appear, and that it's clarifying questions that are not leading in any way, that are not imposing anyone's idea of what that person should do. And you're right, that's completely the opposite of what we typically go to therapy. We're like, tell me what to do, tell me how to fix my life, like, tell me what's wrong with me, and what I need to do about it. And this is just a very different way of this inquire within sort of deal. So what kinds of questions are we asking? Is this really, I know IFS calls them protectors, right? Is this like the little pieces of you, these characters within you, are they're protecting something? And so is it analogous to like inner child work, or is that totally a different thing? Like how would you think about that? And then what kinds of questions are we asking these protectors?
Yeah, yeah. So there are some similarities to like inner child's work, but the three general types of parts that IFS identifies are, number one, most parts are what IFS refers to as manager parts. So they're
Mm,
trying to keep things orderly and moving and productive, and safe and efficient and effective. Then there's a type of part called the firefighter, and that's typically a part that's manifesting in some sort of addiction. So that's a
mm,
part that just, swoops in, perceives an emergency, and just wreaks all kinds of havoc trying to, extinguish that fire, that emotional emergency, often in the form of addiction. So
mm.
that's the firefighter part. And then there's the part that's most similar to kind of the conception of the inner child is the exile parts. And so
Right.
these are very, very vulnerable parts who often we've suppressed because they're so needy and so dark and just craving help and craving assistance, that our manager parts are afraid that if we do acknowledge them, if we do talk to them, their needs will flood the system and
The
overwhelm the
firefighter
system.
can't
So
can't
they're
handle it.
exiled. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're exiled from, the system, and kind of banished to the outskirts. And so what's great about IFS is it has kind of built-in checks and balances so that overwhelm doesn't happen, because at every step of the way, we're always checking in with the client. You asked what sorts of questions we ask the client. And so one of the questions that we'll often ask is if a client's focusing on a particular part or even noticing a particular part, the therapist will ask, like, does it feel okay to focus on that part? Does it feel all
Mm,
right? And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't. And often another part will pop up and chime in and say, no, no, it doesn't. And then
mm,
we talk with that part. And often there's really fruitful information that can come from that part. So it's a great system for just navigating the landscape. And for me on a personal level, like I first encountered the whole concept of IFS, it was not within the therapeutic realm. It was actually at a Dharma talk
mm,
where the person was talking in IFS language, which I discovered only after the fact. But he mentioned this idea that these parts, even if these parts are causing all kinds of problems or damage in our lives, on some level, they're trying to help. And so when we're sitting there, when we're getting quiet and noticing these parts, we should more than just observe these parts. We should actually welcome them and engage them. And instead of trying to like shove them aside or ignore them, we should welcome them and greet them and talk to them and figure out what they're trying to accomplish. And then when we do, we see that they're trying to help. And so it was within the midst of this talk that I realized I've always, just had an issue with anxiety and just feeling anxious and hypervigilant and just super keyed up all the time. And what I realized in just kind of doing some inner work was realizing, oh, that anxious part of me is really trying to keep me safe. It's on guard all the time because it's trying to protect me. Like you said, it's a protector. It's trying to keep me safe. And I realized, wow, it's working really, really hard to try to do that.
Mm.
And so I started developing kind of a joking relationship with this anxious part of mine and just checking in with it and noticing it and just commenting, wow, you are a hard worker. You are just a go-getter. You are on the job all the time and you never take a break, do you? And it was just really just profound for me to go from trying to get rid of this anxiety, trying to just banish this anxious part of mine and just acts like it didn't exist and to make it not exist, to actually having a relationship with it and appreciating it for what it was trying to accomplish and realizing more than anything else that we were on the same team. And so that was the biggest shift that happened for me with IFS, was that instead of walking around at war with myself all the time, like trying to get rid of all these aspects of myself that I either didn't like or that were just making life unpleasant or hard or whatever. Like, no, we were all on the same team. And these parts of mine, like my anxious part, they're more the equivalent of, well-intentioned, sometimes bumbling friends, that are doing their best to help. Sometimes they're really messing up in the process, but like they're lovable, well-meaning friends. And most importantly, just like human beings, they can learn new skills. So these parts are doing those jobs because they think they have to. They think if they don't do those jobs, then things are going to fall apart. But again, they're smart. They're not dumb. And so once they start learning and realizing, oh, well, yes, I was trying to help. For instance, my anxious part has learned, like, yes, I'm trying to help by being on guard all the time and vigilant, but that's actually not helping in many cases. So it would be more useful and more effective for me to apply those skills in, okay, making sure that I get my taxes done on time and
Mm.
just, the administrative tasks that need navigating. And so these parts, just like human beings, they can learn and they can grow. So number one, I found that it was a huge shift, just recognizing, okay, these parts are on my side. Um,
Mm.
but even beyond that, the parts themselves can change and grow and learn. And so they don't cause that same damage or, havoc that they cause in the early stages. So Dick Schwartz, the IFS creator, he's really he really emphasizes that IFS it's more than just learning to like understand and accept these parts. It's truly transformational because the parts themselves change and grow. And again, they're human beings. Like they want to be effective in what they're trying to accomplish. And so they can learn better ways of going about things to do that. And then the last thing I'll mention is that what's very interesting is that these parts are part of a whole internal family system. That's hence the name of the model. And so even when we're working with one particular part and conversing with that part and dialoguing and getting to know that part, all the other parts, even though we're not dealing with them directly, they're in the background, observing,
Mm.
listening, watching. And
Mm.
when they see a part who's typically been ostracized or, kind of quashed, when they see that part being communicated with respect and dignity and being acknowledged and listened to, then even though they're not part of this conversation, those other parts start to relax a little bit, and they start to become just more comfortable because they know that when they have something to say, they'll be treated with that same dignity and respect. And again, just like people, the very worst case scenario for anyone is to be shut down and ignored and just not even acknowledged. And that's often what we do as human beings, because these parts are causing problems and we just wish they would go away. We wish the
Mhm.
anxiety would go away. We wish the depression would go away. We wish the jealousy would go away. And just like people, that's the very last thing that these parts want, because they have valid concerns and valid agendas. And when we just try to banish them, number one, it doesn't work. And number two, the whole system is just like very tensed up and kind of dysfunctional. And once all the parts realize that, okay, I'll be listened to, I will be heard, everything inside us just starts to relax. So it's a fascinating journey. And, we often hear the urge to get to know ourselves and to love ourselves and to get to know who we are. But what I love about IFS is that it offers a very methodical way of going about that,
Mm.
because like, how do we get to know ourselves? Like that's kind of
Yeah.
vague,
What does that mean?
what does
Yeah.
that mean? Yeah. And so IFS is just very, very kind of practical and doable. And it's helpful to work with an IFS practitioner or IFS therapist, but it can also be done, on your own. There are books on how to do IFS on yourself.
Mm.
So, there's so many options. And what I really appreciate about the model was that it wasn't something that Dick Schwartz just came up with, out of like theory or, just to try to create a new therapy model. It was that he heard his clients talking in this language,
Yeah,
he
part
heard
of
them.
me wants to do this, and
Yeah,
part of me wants to do that, and
exactly.
why do I
Exactly.
self-sabotage myself? And yeah, it
Right, right.
does. There is this kind of intuition that you're a
Yeah,
house divided and that whoever
totally.
is you in there is fighting these other impulses. And evolutionary
Yeah.
psychology, is kind of, oh, well, you have independent neural circuits. You're trying to accomplish different
Uh-huh.
goals in sort of a biological context. And that's kind of where I think that's uncharted terrain here is like
Yeah.
how can we borrow some techniques from the system in service of self-knowledge and
Mhm.
understanding ourselves, and maybe bringing some of these patterns of behavior that are not serving us optimally to the surface to be understood better.
Yeah.
And we're always talking about how it's all about information. You just, you're the only thing that changes a cost benefit analysis is better information. And so
Right.
this is a way to access information that may not be completely in conscious awareness for you, especially with something like the exile. That's what seems most obvious to me as like a fully kind of misunderstood or unintegrated part of your personality that has just been really suppressed. And I think we're more aware of the managers and the firefighters. We may not have great regard for them,
Right.
but to kind of really get past the, oh, I've got to deal with my addiction and really look at what the addiction is trying to keep from overwhelming you. um,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and it's hard to get into that sort of thing through an evolutionary psychology model. And
I
so this
do
is,
think, yeah, and I mean, I really do think that IFS is very consistent with EP, because it's the same things that motivate these parts that motivate us,
yeah,
from an evolutionary
right.
perspective. So it's all the same concepts at play. It's just looking at it in a more specific realm with this one particular part, because we've got a lot of different parts, and some of the parts have differing agendas and conflicting interests and
Hmm.
conflicting goals. But you mentioned the cost benefit analysis that we're always running, and these parts are doing the same thing.
Hmm.
And as you mentioned, the the existence of relevant information and full information to
Right.
make those decisions and run the most accurate cost benefit analysis is huge for these parts as well. And often these parts don't have certain information. For instance, one piece of information that the parts often don't have is how old you, the individual, are. So in other words, we'll
Mm,
have a manager trying to run this system thinking that you're still 5 years old and
mm,
need this sort of help and just oversight. And if we just talk to the part and say, do you realize that, Jen is an adult now,
mm,
that she's a grown up and that she's been supporting herself for however long. And often sometimes the part might know that, but often the part does not know that. And once the part absorbs that information, that alone enables the part to make a huge adjustment. So
mm, mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's really,
information, like, it goes both ways. We're getting information from our parts, but in many cases we're also providing them information that again better informs them and enables them to make better decisions.
yeah, yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. It's what is the thinking about where the parts come from? Like what, the origin story of a part. So is it in a particularly traumatic event? Is it in just kind of a childhood pattern that you needed to find a workaround for? Like how does that happen?
That's a great question, and it varies. The short answer is like, I don't know. It depends.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite mantras within IFS is just ask. So often that's something that we'll ask the part. And one question that's commonly posed to these parts is, how long have you been doing this job?
Mm,
How long have you been just taking on the responsibility of making sure that everything's safe or that the oven's always off when you leave the house? Like, how long have you been doing this? And often the answer to that question will point to a certain event that took place. And it was after that, often traumatic event that this part started doing that job or arrived at the belief that, oh, if I don't do this job, then things are just going to completely fall into chaos.
mm,
So we ask the parts, and it's often to do with a particular incident or particular relationship or experience. And the other thing to mention is that, we've got our truth, the way IFS, considers the whole internal landscape is that we've got all these parts, but in addition, we've got our true self. And our true self is kind of our essence, our soul, our being, our awareness, like whatever sort of label you'd like to put on it that makes sense. But we are not our parts, so our parts are within us, but our true self is compassionate, curious, courageous, conscious. Um, so our true self is the being that's observing these other parts, that's kind of our true nature. And IFS enables us to act more and more from that true self rather than being governed by our parts. We don't get rid of our parts because our parts are great. We come to love our parts, and our parts are really good at accomplishing lots of things. But it shifts from us being kind of, trampled sometimes by our parts to our parts, just kind of falling into sort of orbit around our true self, which is, just calmer and just more compassionate. And so the way that we can tell if our true self, is is present and is happening is that when we're working with a particular part, one question that the therapist will always ask is, how do you feel toward that part?
mm,
Because if we feel open and curious and compassionate toward the part, then that's our true self. But if we really don't like that part, if we just feel really antagonistic and suspicious or judgmental or angry or afraid, then that's another part. popping its head in saying, I don't like this part. Like that part is bad news and I don't like that part. And so what we'll do in that situation is we'll talk to that part that clearly has a strong opinion. And so we'll shift our focus from the original part we're working on to this other part. Sometimes what we can do is ask that part, okay, thank you for chiming in. Are you willing to step back while we talk to this other part? Or do you have things that you'd like to air now? Things that you feel are
Mm,
important for us to know in this moment. And again, the answer to that will vary. Sometimes that part will say, okay, like I'm not going away completely, but I'll step back. I'll let you work with this other part right now. And then we'll proceed in the session from there. But other times this part will say, no, I'm not okay stepping back. Like, do you realize what's happening with that other part? And then we'll work with that part. And often the information that comes to light by working with that, so-called secondary part is, even more illuminating than, the original part we were planning to focus the session on. Um,
mm,
so it's really just guided by the natural flow of these parts and their interactions. And the parts themselves start to, they start to get along better. And just, the best way to describe it, like from my personal experience, is that everything inside you just kind of eases up.
mm,
And often the results of an IFS session, like typically a client will come out of one of my IFS sessions, feeling more relaxed and often feeling just much, much better toward a particular part. But there are also all kinds of like side effects of this one interaction that will happen. And often the other parts might pop up during that week. And
mm,
because they've noticed like, oh, this other part fared okay in that interaction.
mm,
This other part was treated pretty fairly. And now I feel okay airing my concern or bringing to light, some other piece of information that I think would be helpful. And so there are lots of kind of ripple effects of working with any individual part. And that's why it does use that word system in the language, is that ultimately these parts are all connected. They are like an internal family. And so we can't, work with one without it affecting the entire system.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of Parker Palmer again, where he's talking about if you want to go into the woods and have a wild animal, you want to spot a wild animal. You're not going crashing in there saying, "Come out, come on out." You're not shouting for it to come out. You're
Yeah.
sitting very quietly and you're
Yeah.
you're you're allowing it to come to you on its own terms. And so
Yeah.
however we want to, if we want to go with the IFS model and kind of think of these as individual entities with agency, or if we want to think of it just as these parts of ourself that are coming to a place of trust and understanding that it's safe to express ourselves here.
Right.
And
Right.
that totally makes sense to me. Have you, for those of us, this is a bit of a self-interested question, but for those of us who have gone through journeys where we're maybe we don't remember much from our childhoods, we're a little bit or a lot disconnected from our emotional landscape, especially for people who want to do this on their own without a therapist. Have you found that? I know you and I both have a background in 12 step and both have had a lot of trouble sort of figuring out what our needs are, or speaking up for and just getting in touch with these things. So if somebody doesn't have kind of that felt sense at all, is there a way that you would recommend that they get into this rather than just, okay, who's there and you want to talk? Because I can see that probably would not work in a lot of cases for maybe even now for me, but certainly a few years ago.
Well, what I have found is that typically when someone's dissociating or feels numb, that's a part.
Oh,
So
that's
that
interesting.
numbness is a part, that
Yeah,
dissociation is a part. And so we'll talk to that part and
yeah,
just find out what happens. Sometimes in the IFS sessions, the part doesn't want to talk and nothing is ever forced within
yeah.
IFS. Nothing's ever forced. Sometimes it's literally sitting with the part, just
Mm,
sitting there and saying, just, can you, I'm here. I'm here. I'm open. I'm present with you. Just know that I'm here. You don't
Mm,
have to say anything, but just know that I'm here. Sometimes it's, does this part want a hug?
mm,
Does this part want, a pat on the shoulder? And that's the great thing about going inside, is that it's magic. We can do anything, so we can,
mm,
if a part needs to, one of the things that will happen with exiles are typically carrying burdens, a burden of some sort, and it's often massive, and they've been carrying this for a long time. And so within an IFS session, one of the processes that happens in IFS, usually after some work, but sometimes it happens earlier on in the process, but we'll give these parts a chance to unburden whatever they've been carrying, whether it's a belief or just a responsibility or a load. And sometimes it's, hurling a stone off a cliff, or sometimes it's, casting something into the air, just letting it evaporate. Sometimes it's throwing something into the ocean. Sometimes it's, physically taking something and walking with that part and then burying it in the ground and just letting it go.
mm,
So
mm,
there are all kinds of options, and that's the wonderful thing too about IFS, is that it really taps into the creativity of both the client and the therapist.
mm.
Because everything's on the table. Whatever the parts want, we can give them. I shouldn't say what they want, because sometimes parts can be very,
Yeah,
very
like,
demanding and
"I
don't
want a
want things
martini."
that are appropriate.
Yeah,
But
like,
um,
that's probably like, "No, you can't have a martini." Yeah,
exactly.
it's like but it's
Right.
such a because 'cause I've been in situations before doing different kinds of crazy woo-woo therapies, including somatic work and other things where, the pressure of that therapeutic relationship, I felt like I kinda had to come up with something. I sort of
Mm,
had to
mm.
but that in itself is a part according to this
Yes,
framework,
yes,
the
yes.
little, would that be a firefighter or a manager or a firefighter?
Probably a manager.
Yeah,
Most parts are managers. Yeah.
this manager
Firefighters are typically the addictions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's an addiction to pleasing in some sense
Sure.
the
Sure.
therapist, but yeah, it did feel more managerial where it's like, okay, whatever, let's just get this over with. Let's just, give this person what they want. Clearly she wants to see some sort of reaction here and that I've had
Mhm.
some kind of breakthrough. And so that I think in all kinds of different therapies that can be a pressure that people are feeling.
A hundred
Um,
percent.
and so
Yeah.
this is like the only concept I've ever heard of, in addition to something like a circle of trust, or just like, I'm just going to sit here and, there's really no pressure or judgment. We're just going to see what comes up. Where we recognize that in itself is this defending part that is not feeling safe.
Right, right. And we always reassure the parts, like, look, you don't have to do anything. You don't have
Yeah.
to say anything. You don't have to change. We're just here. We just want to know what's going on with you. And even that, you don't have to tell us right now if you don't feel comfortable. Again, it's important for, like, the IFS practitioner. This is why experience is helpful. But sometimes there is some nuance, like, okay, is that another part popping its head in? Or is this what's happening with the part we're already working with? So it takes
Mm,
some
mm,
take some attunement to the various possibilities. But one of the other parts that you mentioned, like, dissociation and kind of numbness or lack of
mhm,
memory.
mhm.
Um, and the other part that I would say often comes up, especially with, people like yourself and people like me who have done a lot of this work, and we know a lot of the, psychological lingo. Often we'll have a part that's an analyzer part.
Oh, totally like
And this part,
intellectual.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
smart, always
Yeah.
wants to pop in and
Yeah.
just explain what's happening
Oh,
and
I
why
know
it's
what this is.
happening and where it came from.
Yeah.
And those, again, those parts are great, and they're really smart, and they're often correct, but we need to recognize they're a part, So again, we will often say to that part, okay, I think this is that your analyzer part, chiming in, and can you check with that part and, see if she's willing just to take a step back, just let her know she can take a break right now. She can go take a nap. She can go, like lie in
Mm,
the sun for a few minutes while we do this
mm,
other conversation. She's off duty, she's off
mm,
duty. Because again, these parts are doing these jobs because they think it's necessary to the safety and well-being of you and the entire system. So if they didn't have to do them, then often there are a lot of other things they'd rather be doing. So that's another question that we often ask the client
mm,
or the part. We ask the client to ask the part. If you didn't have to do this job, what do you think you'd like to do instead? And
mm.
then often all these very interesting suggestions come to the table. Like, oh, well, I kind of always wanted to try, skydiving. Like, I know it's crazy, but it's something that has nothing to do with like the role that this part has been playing. And again, just like people, once we give them the opportunity to be something different from what they feel they have to be, it's astonishing what comes out. And it's a very fun process in many cases, because again, these parts, they're doing this because they think they have to, but once they realize that not only do they not have to, but like in some ways they're impeding their own goals because they're trying to help, and when they realize like, oh, that's actually not helping, they're
Mm.
often thrilled. They're very happy, and sometimes they get to retire, sometimes they get to do something different. So it's a really dynamic process, and there's simply no telling what will come out of it.
It's like I can see it being maybe especially for somebody who's really resistant to it and who doesn't feel like they're a very creative person and they just think this is all just a bunch of make believe, that it's a way of really tapping into that childlike creativity, like these are my imaginary friends. These are I think children have that just natively an ability to kind of be in touch with these parts of themselves and an awareness of themselves as this multifaceted being, and to kind of be able to allow people to get back into that space where they can pursue that creativity and have it reaffirmed by the parts wanting to go skydiving or wanting to learn how to throw a pot or something, that just is going to open up so much possibility for people who feel really stuck in life. And I can see that being super positive for people. What's the craziest thing one of your parts ever came up with that surprised you? Maybe
Oh,
not.
yeah, that's a good question. Um, the craziest thing. I think for me, this isn't like a crazy, wild party type thing. But for me, it was really the unburdening process that was really helpful,
Mm,
because these parts had just been carrying these heavy burdens.
yeah.
And, they just got to let go of those burdens and just got to kind of like, my parts like to skip, when they're unburdened, like
Mm,
they like to skip and just like, just kind of be silly. So I would say that's like the biggest shift that has happened for my parts, is they go from being like hyper serious and hyper vigilant and hyper, everything's on the line all the time, to just like being kind of silly. Like it's not,
mm,
nothing monumental,
mm,
that they need to do or want to do, but they just get to just kind of like goof around and be playful and laugh a little bit and
mm,
just feel safe, and they just feel freer because it's like they're not required to stop caring about the things that they care about. They often still want to help, because they just like to help. They feel good when they help. But there's a difference between that sort of helping that they can do that makes them feel good, and having responsibility for everything to be on their shoulders.
mm,
So it just shifts from, just being this overwhelming like weight on them to, they just get to just loosen up and be themselves. And they also don't have to decide right away, because just like just like somebody who, wins the lottery or something, maybe they don't like know on day one what they want to do for the rest of their life, and now that they don't have to like be a janitor anymore. But just having that weight gone, allows that possibility and that blossoming to unfold in time, so
Right.
sometimes we won't, these parts might not know in the moments like, okay, what do I want to do instead. That might take some time. And again, just like people, there's no rush. We always tell the parts like all the time in the world, like no pressure, no
Mhm.
rush,
Mhm.
whatever you want to do, whatever you feel good about. There's no real agenda other than number one, letting them know that your true self, like is here, is listening, and cares, and wants to know you, is welcoming you, is more than just seeing you and observing you, but and tolerating you, but actually welcoming you. You're part of the family. You're here.
Yeah. 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 What is the theory like in terms of parts that are difficult to accept and be friends with? The firefighters strike me as, it's going to be really hard to befriend that part of you that has the strong addictive impulse
Mhm.
or compulsion. So what is the thinking in terms of how that firefighting is protecting that exile? Is the mechanism really just distraction, and so we're not going to notice the exile, or we're going to drown it out with something that is more costly, or kind of what is that theory behind it? Because I find that sort of
Yeah.
a very interesting, that connection between those two types of
Mhm.
characters seems like a
Mhm.
really tough bond to break.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good question. I would say that the agenda is usually distraction,
Mm,
um, and also there's a lot of lack of awareness,
mm,
there may be some awareness, but typically that firefighter is just operating on pure adrenaline, so
mm, mm,
sensing a disaster, rushing in, you know, just like blasting everything with the fire hose,
mm,
destroying everything in sight, but believing that, okay, this is necessary and important because I'm putting out this fire.
mm,
So there's a lot of lack of awareness. Once we bring some more awareness to that part, it will often realize like, oh, yes, I thought I was helping. I thought the ends justified the means, but now I'm realizing like, oh, my cost benefit analysis there was off. So it'll ease up a little bit typically. We'll also recognize that part's bravery and that part's valor during many times in our life when it
mm,
did save us, when it did swoop in and save us.
mhm,
It's a human being, we'll have a natural affinity for some parts more than others, like that's just natural human nature. So it will always be a process of checking in, how do you feel toward that part? Because if we're
mm,
feeling judgmental or angry or dismissive, then that indicates there's another part popping in. That's not our
mhm,
true self. Our true self will be open and curious and compassionate and calm and won't feel threatened by that firefighter part. So we'll get to know that part better. The exile and the firefighter. Yeah, in that question, you really touch on what's to me a very interesting facet of these internal family systems is that these parts do have connections with one another.
right,
And so they'll
yeah,
have bonds, they'll have alliances. So sometimes, yeah, an exile could definitely feel bonded or attached to a firefighter, or it could feel exiled by the firefighter because the second the exile starts to, kind of show
mm,
herself, the
mm,
firefighter, to the firefighter, the exile herself may be considered a source of grave danger to the system because, oh no, if she starts making her needs known, then that's just going to flood the system. We're not equipped to handle this, needy, desperate child. Often the
Mm,
exile is kind of a childlike part. So, and
mm,
sometimes there may be, animosity between those two. So there's a lot that can happen, just like in families, real life families, infinite number of like sorts of connections and dynamics among these different parts. And again, we just have to see, as a therapist, I
mm,
just ask, just ask the part, ask the client. And another very important aspect of IFS that I should mention is that a key part of the whole IFS process is, number one, just learning not to identify with these parts. We'll
mm,
often talk in terms that indicate identification, like I'm anxious, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I am this. And really, that's a part. I have a sad part. I also have happy parts and excited parts and nervous parts. So number one in the process is just getting enough distance between our true self and these parts to be able to communicate with the part. Because sometimes the parts, sometimes they're very distant and leery and wary, and they're hesitant to come close because we've just like shoved them aside so much of the time. But by the same token, sometimes these parts will be very clingy and overbearing. And so
mm,
in those cases, the therapist will suggest to the client, can you just ask that part to step back a little bit, just to give you a little space, just so we can, just so we can all like breathe a little more quietly and just see each other, just explain to this part that you'd like to talk to her and that it's easier if you have a little bit of distance between you. And so, is the part willing to do that? If the
mm,
part's not willing to do that, that's always a possibility. you know what does the part need? Does the part need a hug? Does the part just need some quiet time of presence, of just sitting? Again, anything's on the table. So we don't, as the IFS practitioner, I'm not running the show. Like I'm
yeah,
just
you don't have
picking up on
an
the nuances.
agenda. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
So
see that I would have a part that if nothing was happening, it would be coming up being like, well, I'm wasting my money here, like, come on, let's
totally.
move this along.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
that's
Oh, 100%.
working with the impression manager who's like,
Uh-huh.
I can tell what you want. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you the breakthrough. Um,
Yep.
and I have a
Yep.
bunch of the, just personally,
Uh-huh.
from my own situation, I have a bunch of those parts working together that are like, okay, we're just going to be very brutally efficient here and just move the ball
Mhm.
forward. So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
such a I really the theme that's emerging from this and so much of what I'm reading and thinking about lately is just give the system space to be true to itself, to find its truth, to express its truth, and that we can't do that when we're constantly reactive, when we're constantly distracted, when we're in active addiction, et cetera, et cetera. So I just really I love the concept. There's that line that it came up in that longer the Brene Brown section that I posted in the first episode of this show. Uh,
Which I loved. I love that first
that
episode so
yeah,
much.
well,
Yeah.
and that interview with Tim Ferriss that she does later in the episode, she talks about this famous. It's attributed to many different Buddhist sages, but it's the most important thing in your life is what you're unwilling to feel. Like that's what's actually driving the car is what you're unwilling to feel. And all of these parts are like bundling up all of those things that you're unwilling to feel because they have found ways to manage them and hide them away and deflect them. And so I just think that anything we can do to start to bring those things out into daylight, and this is just a beautiful, super creative, very childlike way to do that. So I hope people feel free to explore it. If they want to book a session with you, how can they find you?
There's information on my website, christinemelanie.benson.com is the best way to find out how to
Awesome.
do that.
And if they're just kind of looking on their own, do you have a particular book recommendation? I can put it in the notes and everything too for people to kind of get started with DIY.
Yeah, there's a book. I I don't know if this is the exact title, but it's something like doing IFS on yourself.
Mm.
Something along those lines. So there's a
Yeah.
very just practical, useful guidebook for doing that. And one thing that I will say about IFS is that often people make a lot more progress in just a handful of sessions than
Mm.
they do in, years of talk therapy, just because it's just a different approach. And it just, like you said, it brings to light the things that we haven't wanted to see and feel, but it also does it in a way that's just safe, because
Yeah.
that's like ultimately what we're worried about, is like not being safe. We don't feel
Right.
like it's safe to feel those things. And sometimes it's not. But the great thing about the IFS model is that we'll identify that long before we take on more than we can handle. Um,
Mm.
so so
Mm.
it's a beautiful system in that there are just these built-in checks and balances. And again, just for the parts, even a part we never communicate with directly, when it sees other parts being treated fairly and being treated with dignity, it's
Right.
amazing the effect that it has on the entire system. And like I said, for me personally, it just was a paradigm shift from walking around at war with myself. I had the parts that I liked and wanted to highlight about myself, and then I had the many, many parts,
That's a really important point, that some of the parts, yeah, I sort of tend to focus on the negative self-sabotaging parts, but there's also, totally other little bits of facade and false front and impression
Yeah,
management that are,
yeah,
yeah, they seem very positive. They're very like you're, a higher level of extroversion than is really true to the self, or
yeah,
a
yeah,
higher level of conscientiousness than is true to the self. Like you're
right.
trying to be more valuable to people. um,
Yeah. And
yeah.
it's not bad. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
bad thing. Yeah, we'll have an optimist part. We'll have a
Mm-hmm.
determined part, we'll have a
Mm-hmm.
cheerful, like silver lining part.
Yeah.
And those parts, it's just because, a part is a part doesn't mean that the part is bad. There's nothing,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, but by the same token, like you said, even those more positive parts that we're proud of, they're also not our true self,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
our true self. So
it's
it's very interesting.
It's super, it's like the give a man a fish, teach a man to fish parable. Like a lot of therapy is, when you say people can make more progress in a short amount of time, it's because they're coming to this place of self knowledge, self integration, self trust, rather than I'm still broken externally to, please fix me, please tell me, what's wrong with me or what I need to do. And it's offloading your own power and your own sovereignty to someone else, instead of really kind of going within and
Exactly.
befriending yourself, and
Right,
yeah,
right.
dropping that judgment. Yeah.
And also, just again, I really want to emphasize that we're not doomed to our current parts. We
Yeah.
will we will befriend them, and we will welcome them, and we will find out what's going on with them, and we'll learn typically that they're trying to help in some way. But again, the process does not end there, because the key part of the process is, once these parts get that additional information that you, Jen, are an adult now. You don't need that level of
Hmm.
oversight they've been providing since you were 5 years old, and were abandoned by your, cousin or your mother or whoever it
Hmm.
was.
Hmm.
Um, the parts themselves can change and grow, and they want to. They want to,
Oh, of
because
course.
they
Yeah.
want everything to be
They've
better.
been in arrested development too. So and I
Yeah,
love that
yeah,
idea, because one of the first reactions I had to, okay, well, we're going to bring the parts to awareness and relieve them of their job, was like, oh no, no, I can't lose them. Like I don't
right,
want to kick them out,
right,
or I feel this real
right.
sadness about losing them. But the idea of allowing them to grow and to follow their own bliss, and to and to
Yeah,
do what it is,
yeah,
that because of it's all you, of course, this
yeah,
is all you.
yeah.
And so you are liberating these pieces of yourself to really pursue their true passions and desires that they haven't been able to pursue because they've been so busy protecting you. um,
Exactly,
and
yeah, you
and that
summed it
is
up beautifully.
And that
Yeah,
is just so like, what I mean, what else are we doing in therapy if not that? So,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. It's really about freedom
Yeah.
because these parts have often been autonomous. They're just doing what they feel they have to do, playing this role because they think they have to. They think it's essential and that
Right.
the fate of your internal system, hinges on it. And when they learn that, oh, it doesn't, this part, this job that they're doing isn't necessary or even useful in the same way that they had believed it to be,
Mhm.
they become free. They're free to do something else. And again, they'll still do things. They'll still want to do things. It's not like they just become
Mhm.
slugs. Or I mean, sometimes they do. Sometimes they just want to retire and rest because they've
Yeah,
just been
no,
working
like,
so hard.
go
So sometimes
totally.
sometimes they do, but often just like people, they just discover new interests and they become free and you become free, and it just all is more peaceful and relaxing and easeful inside. For me it's like a tangible feeling. I remember, again, that specific experience with my anxious part, and when I
Mm.
realized, oh my goodness, boy, is that part like a hard worker and
Mm.
boy, has she been, just on the ball like every second of every
Mm.
day for my
Not a
whole
single day
life.
off for
Not
40,
a
50
single
years.
day off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just, just like really just developing a fondness for that part, which has, since evolved and relaxed and loosened up and is no longer that uptight, like hyper vigilant guardian all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's not like we don't have like, I'm sure you still have anxiety periodically, and I'm sure
Never,
we're
never.
not
Yeah.
transforming ourselves in some sort of like magical in 5 easy steps kind of way, but
Right.
it
Right.
is this process of yeah, dialing down the tension and just,
Totally. Yeah.
finding that space of ease and relaxation, and also just more presence with
Mhm.
those things that are still part of us, but that,
Mhm.
don't they're not going to rule us in the same way. Um,
Right, right. And
yeah.
we just become, yeah, we become more curious
Mm.
because, number one, our parts come to trust us, our true self, once they communicate in a respectful and compassionate way, they come to trust us more. So they ease up. And then also, as we get to know our parts, we also come to trust them more in
Yeah.
the sense that we recognize that, okay, if this part has a concern, there's something to it,
I don't feel
there's
safe.
something to
Like,
it.
why don't I feel safe?
Yeah.
Is that something
Yeah.
about the relationship I'm in or the work that I'm doing, or
Yeah.
like, what
Yeah.
do I need to look at in my life that
Yeah.
is bringing this part back to its job after it went into retirement?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
because we wanna
yeah.
hear what our parts have to say because we
Mhm.
know they're not making stuff up out of nothing, like, it's coming from somewhere. So
Yeah.
so we wanna know what is going on with our parts and what they have to say. Again, it's the the stakes are lowered because, we realize, like, okay, we don't have to be governed by our parts anymore, and at the same time we recognize, like, there's something to it. These parts are smart, they generally have very valid concerns. So let's find out what's happening. And again, the possibilities are infinite as to what can happen from there. Sometimes it's just a case of reminding the part, like, again, do you remember that I'm an adult now? Do you remember that I'm
Yeah,
not 5 years
right.
old anymore? So sometimes, because these parts have developed habits, have developed, routines and ways of doing things. So sometimes, the learning curve is not, completely chronological. Sometimes the parts will, fall into their own habits. So sometimes it takes a little reassurance and just reminding. And again, just reassuring that part. And by the same token, the whole system, I'm here, I care, I'm present with you. At the very least, know that I'm present. You're okay. We're all okay. And, talk to me if you want, when you want.
Ah, beautiful. Well, thanks so much for sharing this with us. I'm sure people are going to love to play with us a little bit. And your website will be in the notes and all of that. So I hope you guys reach out to her if you are interested in a session or want to buy her book on Amazon or anything else that you're up to. So thank you so much for joining and teaching me a lot. I have learned a lot. I've always been sort of curious about it. I also think I first heard about it through the Buddhist world. So this has been very educational for me too.
Well,
So
great. Thank you so
yeah.
much for having me.
All right. Well, we will see you next time.
Okay.
All right.